The road into Alderton, Kentucky had a way of making a person feel forgotten. It curved through low hills heavy with second-growth timber, past rusted mailboxes and fields gone to thistle. And by the time it reached the edge of town, it was barely wide enough for two trucks to pass without one of them easing onto the gravel shoulder. The mountains rose behind everything, patient and enormous, the way mountains always are in eastern Kentucky. Not dramatic, not beautiful in any postcard sense, just permanent. The kind of permanence that makes human troubles feel small and human stubbornness feel appropriate. Ruth Carver had lived inside that permanence her whole life. 68 years of Kentucky mornings, 68 years of watching the ridgeline go from black to gray to green as the sun hauled itself up. She had outlasted a coal company, two droughts, a husband's long, slow dying, and the steady, quiet erasure of everything Alderton had once been. The hardware store was a Dollar General now. The movie house was a church that met twice and then stopped meeting. The diner was still the diner, mostly because Patsy Holt was too stubborn to close it and too proud to sell. That Tuesday evening in late June, Ruth sat in the corner booth of Buckhorn Diner with her grandson Eli and a laminated menu she had not needed to read in 15 years. The overhead fans turned slowly enough to be decorative. The air smelled of coffee and frying oil, and the particular warmth of a building that had been cooking food inside it since 1962. Eli had the children's menu in front of him, but was not looking at it. He was bent over a composition notebook, the tip of his tongue showing at the corner of his mouth, the way it always did when he was concentrating hard on something. He was 10 years old and spent his summers with Ruth because his mother Ruth's daughter Nora worked long shifts at a hospital in Lexington, and because Eli himself had once told his mother very seriously that summers at Grandma Ruth's were the only time he felt like he was allowed to slow down. Ruth had heard that secondhand and had not known what to make of it except that it made her chest ache in a way that felt like love. She watched him draw for a moment before picking up her coffee. It had gone lukewarm. She drank it anyway. Earl had always teased her about that, about her ability to drink coffee at any temperature without complaint, and she had told him it was because she had learned to take things as they came, and he had said that was either wisdom or stubbornness, and she had said those were the same thing. Earl had been gone 3 years. 3 years of sleeping in the middle of the bed, 3 years of cooking for one and then 2 in the summers when Eli came. 3 years of maintaining 40 acres of hill country on her own, repairing fences and hauling feed and descending into the crawl space under the house when the pipes made noises that pipes should not make. She had been a nurse for 22 years before her knees made that work impossible, and she had brought the same methodical competence to the tending of the farm. She did not ask for help, not because she was too proud she was a little, but because asking for help in Harlan County meant waiting for it. And waiting was a luxury that fences and pipes and sick animals could not afford. Eli looked up from his notebook. "Bah, can I get the patty melt?" "You can get whatever you want. Even pie after." "Even pie after." He went back to his drawing. Patsy came by with a coffee pot, refilled Ruth's cup without asking, set a glass of chocolate milk in front of Eli without being asked. That was the particular gift of a place where people had known each other long enough to skip the formalities. "Quieter than usual," Ruth said. Patsy glanced around the diner. A few booths occupied, 2 men at the counter nursing coffee and saying nothing to each other. An older couple near the window. "Rain coming, maybe?" Patsy said. "People feel it in their knees before the clouds catch up." She moved on. Ruth looked out the window. The sky above the ridge was the deep, bruised purple of late evening, and the first stars were beginning to show in the strip of clear sky to the east. The parking lot was half empty. The dollar store across the street had its lights on, but no customers visible through the glass. She was thinking about the pump. The well pump had been making a grinding noise for a week, and she had tightened every fitting she could reach, and the noise had gotten quieter, but not gone. And she was trying to decide whether quieter was good enough or whether quieter was just a slower path to the same problem. She was thinking about this in the practical, unworried way she thought about most things. Not anxious, just inventorying the same way she used to inventory a patient's condition. Working through what she knew and what she did not know, and what the next step logically was. She was in the middle of this when she heard it. It began as a vibration more than a sound. Something felt in the booth cushion, in the soles of her feet, before it registered in her ears. Then it rose into the audible range, a low collective thunder that was not thunder. And it built and built until it was unmistakably the sound of engines. Many engines, large ones, all running in the same register. The kind of sound that did not happen in Alderton on a Tuesday evening or on any other evening. Patsy stopped wiping the counter. The two men at the counter straightened. The couple near the window turned their heads. Ruth watched the parking lot. They came around the bend at the edge of town in a long procession, headlights cutting through the dusk like a string of moving lanterns. She counted instinctively the way she had always counted things: beds, doses, heartbeats. 1, 2, 5, 10 more. They filled the parking lot in an organized sweep, pulling into spaces and along the edges with the practiced ease of people who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 different parking lots from here to wherever they had started. The engines cut off in a rolling sequence, each one falling silent a few seconds after the last, until the quiet that returned was somehow louder than the noise that had preceded it. The door of Buckhorn Diner opened. Cold evening air pushed in. And then they came. The first three were large men in leather vests and boots patches, covering their chests and backs, and they moved through the diner the way men move when they are accustomed to a room changing around them when they enter it. They took the long table near the back. More followed. Within 2 minutes there were perhaps 15 of them inside, and Ruth could see more still outside leaning against their bikes, lighting cigarettes, talking in the low voices of men who had been riding for a long time and were finally still. Eli had looked up from his notebook. He was watching with the frank, open curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to perform caution. His eyes went from face to face, to vest, to tattoo, to next face with the calm thoroughness of someone cataloging something interesting. Ruth watched the people around her. The older couple had stopped eating. One of the men at the counter had his hand near his phone. Patsy had backed against the far wall with the practiced stillness of a woman who has survived 60 years in a small town by knowing when to be invisible. The last man through the door was not the largest, but he was the one the room noticed most. He stood perhaps 6'2", broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested real work rather than a gym. And his hair was the salt and pepper of a man in his early 50s who had spent most of those years outside. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, faded now to a thin, pale line, and his eyes moved across the room with a slow, comprehensive attention that took in everything and revealed nothing. He wore the same leather vest as the others, the back patch reading Iron Covenant in an arc of white letters above a central image that Ruth did not examine yet. And he walked to the end of the long table and sat. And when he sat, the remaining bikers who had been waiting for something to happen all seemed to settle at once, like a flock finding its direction. His name was Dax Steele, and he had not been in Harlan County in 14 years. Ruth did not know that yet. She was watching Eli. The boy had his notebook, half-raised pencil in hand, but he was not drawing. He was looking at the man who had just sat down, Dax Steele, the last through the door, with the particular focus of someone who has just recognized something they were not expecting to recognize. His head was tilted slightly to the left, the same angle it went when he was trying to work something out. "Bah," Eli said. His voice was not a whisper. Children do not naturally whisper in situations that call for whispering because they have not yet learned that situations call for whispering. Ruth said, eyes still on him. "That man has the same tattoo as you." The diner went quiet in the way that diners go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. It was not a dramatic silence, not an instantaneous one. It rolled through the room in a wave, Conversation dying table by table, spoon touching cup, and then not moving. The background noise of a functioning restaurant simply stopping. Ruth's hand wrapped around her coffee cup did not move. Eli, who had put his pencil down now and was leaning forward with the earnest helpfulness of a child who believes he has provided useful information, pointed. He pointed at Dax Steele's left forearm, which was resting on the table, the sleeve of his shirt rolled to the elbow. And on that forearm was a tattoo that Ruth had not looked at directly yet, but that Eli had seen in less than a minute. The cross with the chains and the crack. He looked at Ruth. Just like yours, Ba, on your wrist. 14 people in Iron Covenant turned to look at Ruth Carver. Ruth Carver turned her left wrist over on the table. The tattoo was small and faded with age. The lines thickened slightly the way old tattoos do, but the image was unmistakable. A cross wrapped in 2 loops of heavy chain, the crossbar iron dark, and at the upper right corner of the vertical bar, a thin crack that ran in a shallow V shape, barely half an inch long, but precise. The skin around it was the creased, freckled skin of a woman who had worked outdoors for decades. The tattoo itself was 14 years old, given in a room in Pikeville, by a man who had been trying to express something that words were not adequate to contain. Earl had noticed it the evening she came home from Pikeville. She had worn long sleeves for 2 days, which was not her habit, and Earl had the particular patience of a man who understood that some things arrived in their own time. On the 3rd evening, she had sat down at the kitchen table and pushed her sleeve up and shown him. He had looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then he had looked at her, and she had told him the whole of what had happened, the door, the 4 days, the men who came asking. He had not interrupted her once. When she finished, he had taken her hand in both of his and looked at the tattoo again and said very quietly, "That was the bravest thing I've ever heard of anyone doing." And she had said she did not think it was brave. She thought it was just the next thing that needed doing. And Earl had said that was what all brave things were, just the next thing done by someone who did not stop to measure the cost. She had thought about that for years afterward. Dax Steele had not moved. His eyes had traveled from the boy to the woman in the corner booth, and they stayed there now, not threatening, not warm, just fixed with an attention that was its own kind of weight. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How old is that tattoo?" His voice was low, and even the voice of a man who did not raise it often because he did not need to. Ruth met his eyes. She had the eyes of a woman who had looked at things she did not want to see and had kept looking anyway, because looking away did not make them go away. 14 years, she said. Something moved through the room, not audible, not visible, but felt the way a change in air pressure is felt before the storm arrives. The man to Dax's left, older, gray-bearded, with a ring on his right hand that had seen many years and many roads, leaned forward slightly. His eyes had not left Ruth's wrist. He said almost to himself, the words coming out careful as a man counting steps on unfamiliar ground. "The crack runs northeast." "It does," Ruth said. "That crack was an accident." "I know," he told me. The gray-bearded man sat back in his chair. He said one word, "Boss." Dax Steele's jaw moved once the way a jaw moves when a person is processing something that requires the body's participation. Then he said, quietly enough that only those close could hear, "What's your name, ma'am?" "Ruth Carver." 2 bikers near the window exchanged a look. The gray-bearded one closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. A younger man, broad-shouldered, maybe 30, who had been leaning back with his arms crossed, straightened in his chair as if something had pulled him upright. Eli was watching all of this with great interest. He had no idea what was happening. He was delighted by it. Dax looked at Ruth for a long moment, with the expression of a man looking at something he had long ago accepted he would never see. Then he said, "Harlan County, Ruth Carver, the nurse." "Former nurse," Ruth said. "I tend livestock now." A sound that might have been a laugh, dry and involuntary, escaped from somewhere down the table. Dax did not smile, but something around his eyes changed. "We've been looking for you," he said, "for a long time." "I'm not hard to find," Ruth said. I've been right here. We didn't know the county. We knew the first name and the tattoo. He paused. We knew Pikeville 14 years ago. We knew a woman who opened a door when she had every reason to keep it shut. He stopped. The diner was so quiet that the ceiling fan was audible. Wade Briggs is alive because of you. The name landed in the room and in Ruth's chest simultaneously. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 14 years. She had not forgotten it. She was not someone who forgot things. It was not a character of hers. But she had filed it away in the part of herself where she kept things that were true and complete and did not require further visiting. Wade Briggs, 37 years old when she first saw him curled against the side of her door in the dark, breathing in shallow pulls, his shirt soaked through with blood, so dark it looked black in the porch light. "Is he well?" Ruth asked. "He is. He's in Colorado now. He got out 2 years ago, left the road, got a piece of land, raises horses." Dax paused. "He talks about you. Every time we get together, if enough time has passed, somebody brings up what happened in Pikeville, and Wade talks about you." Ruth was quiet. Eli had his chin in his hands and was watching her face, the way children watch adults, when they sense that something important is being said. "You want to hear it then?" Ruth said. It was not quite a question. "We know it," Dax said. "We've heard it from Wade. I'd like to hear it from you." The diner around them had begun to breathe again, tentatively, the way a room breathes when it has decided that whatever was about to happen is not what it initially feared. Patsy had moved back toward the counter. The couple near the window had turned back to their food, though they were eating slowly, attending to the conversation with the transparent effort of people trying to appear uninterested. Ruth set her coffee cup down. She looked at Eli, who looked back at her with his open, patient face. "I was living in Pikeville," she said. "This was 14 years back. Earl was still alive then. We still had the farm. But I was taking a locum contract, staying in a rented house for 3 months, covering a clinic while their regular practitioner was out for surgery." She paused. It was November, cold. I had finished a late shift, gotten home around 11, and I was in the kitchen when I heard someone at the door. Not knocking, hitting. The way people hit when their hand is losing the argument with their body about whether to keep moving. Dax was still. All of Iron Covenant was still. "I opened the door and he fell in," Ruth said. "Or partly fell, he caught himself on the frame. Big man, tattooed leather vest. He'd been shot twice, once in the side and once through the shoulder. The shoulder one clean through, but the side wound was the problem. Something internal. He was the color of old paper, and his breathing had that sound in it." "What sound?" Eli asked. "The sound that means the body is running out of time to decide," Ruth said. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. "I had my kit in the house because I always had my kit. I got him inside. I got him on the kitchen table." She paused. "I didn't ask his name. I didn't ask how. I asked where it hurt and how long and could he tell me his blood type, and he gave me his blood type, which I respected." One of the bikers at the far end of the table made a small sound. Ruth did not look up. "I packed the side wound. That was the critical thing. The shoulder I could deal with after. He stayed awake, which helped. Unconscious patients can't tell you when something changes." He talked, not about what had happened, but other things. He talked about his daughter in Bowling Green. He talked about a dog he'd had as a kid. I think he was talking to stay present. She looked at her coffee cup. "I let him talk. It costs nothing, and it helps." "He told us you talked back," said the gray-bearded biker. "He said you talked about your husband, your farm." Earl had been having a hard year. Sometimes you say things to strangers you wouldn't say to the people you love, because strangers can hold it without it becoming a weight in the relationship. Ruth looked up. "I told him about the farm, and he told me about the road. We talked for about 2 hours before he was stable enough that I thought he might sleep. And then they came," Dax said. "And then they came." The diner was very quiet. "4 of them," Ruth said, "going door to door on the block. I heard them 2 houses down. There was not much time to think about it. I put him in the back bedroom under the bed. He could not get there himself. I helped him, and I covered the floor with a folded quilt so there was no blood visible from the doorway. Then I opened the front door before they knocked. Eli was absolutely motionless. They asked if I'd seen a man, described him. I said I'd seen a man walking east toward the highway maybe 20 minutes ago. I said it looking them in the eye the way I used to tell patients. Hard things, not aggressive, not overly calm, just direct. The way you say something when it's simply true, even when it isn't. She paused. Two of them looked past me into the house. I stepped slightly to one side, not all the way, just enough to show I wasn't hiding the view. And I said, "You're welcome to look around if you need to, but I'd like to keep the cold out, and I have an early shift." One of them looked at me for a long moment. Then they left. Silence. "He stayed 4 days," Ruth said. "By the third day he could sit up, and by the fourth he could walk slowly. I made him eat. He was not a good patient at first. Men who are accustomed to strength dislike having to be cared for, but he came around." The faintest shift in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was related to one. I told him I had treated more difficult patients than him, which was true, and that I had never lost one to stubbornness yet, which was only mostly true. The gray-bearded biker laughed. A real laugh, not polite. "When he could travel, he wanted me to come and meet the club," Ruth said. I told him no. I didn't say it unkindly. I just said I had a husband and a farm and a temporary position at a clinic, and none of those things left room for more complications. He understood. He was a man who understood when people meant what they said. She looked at her wrist. The tattoo. He gave me that before he left. He said in his world it was a mark of protection that any member of Iron Covenant who saw it would know the person who wore it had given their safety to save one of them. He said it without sentimentality. He said it the way you'd say, "Here's the key, the door sticks on the left." She paused. I let him give it to me because it seemed to matter to him more than it cost me. And because I liked the image, the cross, and the chains. It suited me better than anything I might have chosen for myself. Dax Steele had been listening without moving. Now he looked at the tattoo on his own arm, the same cross, the same chains, larger, more elaborate, but unmistakably the same design. His version did not have the crack. "Wade's tattoo has the crack," Dax said. "Your tattoo has the crack. No other version of that image anywhere in Iron Covenant has it. It was his version of a signature." He paused. "When he gave it to you, he told us after. He said if any of you ever find a woman in Kentucky with a cracked cross on her wrist, treat her the same way you'd treat me. Take care of her the same way you'd take care of me." Ruth was quiet. "We tried to find you," Dax said, "after Wade told us. But all we had was first name and county, and Harlan County is large, and our resources for that kind of search are limited. We found 3 Ruths in the county over the years. None of them were you." He looked at Eli. "Until tonight." Eli had been listening with complete absorption. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Dax. He looked at Ruth's wrist. A child's face processing the revelation that the person they know best is also someone they have never fully known. "Bah," he said slowly. "You never told me." "It was a long time ago," Ruth said, "and it was not my story to tell. It was his." "But the tattoo." "I told you it was a reminder to be brave." Ruth looked at him steadily. "That was true. I just left out what I was being reminded of." Eli considered this with the seriousness of a person to whom honesty matters. Then he nodded once accepting it. It was at precisely this moment that Ruth's phone rang. Not her cell phone that was in her truck, as it usually was. She did not have the habit of carrying it on her person, the way the young did tethered to it. This was the diner's landline, the old wall unit near the kitchen, and Patsy answered it, and Patsy's face changed in the specific way that a face changes when the news coming through the phone is the kind that requires immediate action. Patsy put her hand over the receiver. "Ruth," she said. Her voice was careful. "It's Floyd Weaver. Says there are men at your property." The diner went still again. "What kind of men?" Ruth asked. Her voice did not change. This was a thing about Ruth Carver. Her voice did not change when things got bad. It had not changed when the doctor in Lexington told her Earl's scans looked like what they both already knew they looked like. And it did not change now. 3 of them. Floyd saw them from his place. They're over on your east fence. He says they've got bolt cutters on the gate. Ruth was already reaching for her jacket, Patsy said, hesitating. Floyd says they got a truck, Ruth, and they had papers. Ruth paused with her jacket half on. Papers. Looked like legal papers, he said. Official looking. Ruth finished putting on her jacket. She looked at Eli, who was already watching her with the alert readiness of a child who has spent enough time with her to know that look means something is happening and he should be prepared to move. Then she looked at Dax Steele. Dax Steele was already standing. He had not asked. He had not been invited. He was standing the way a man stands when a decision has been made, not by choice, but by the logic of everything that led to this moment. The 14 bikers inside were also moving, not hurrying, not dramatic about it, but moving with purpose, checking jackets, standing the particular efficient gathering of people who have answered this kind of signal before. You don't have to, Ruth said. She meant it. She was not a woman who deflected help she needed, but she was also not a woman who assumed it was owed. Dax looked at her. You packed a wound in your kitchen and stood between a dying man and the people who wanted him dead, he said. We've been waiting 14 years to stand between you and something. You're not going to tell me to sit back down. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Earl would have liked him, she thought, for exactly the same reasons Earl would have found him infuriating. Then let's go, she said. Eli grabbed his notebook. You stay with Patsy, Ruth said. Eli opened his mouth. Eli, he closed it. He looked at Patsy. Patsy looked at him with the expression of a woman who has raised children and knows the precise texture of that battle. I'll get you pie, Patsy said. Eli sat down. He watched through the diner window as Buckhorn's parking lot filled with the organized motion of 34 members of Iron Covenant moving toward their machines in the last light of a June evening in Harlan County, his grandmother in the center of them, her jacket buttoned, her chin level, walking toward whatever was waiting at her farm with the same unhurried competence with which she did everything else. He watched until they turned onto the road, and the sound of the engines swelled and then faded to the east. And then he looked at Patsy. She'll be okay, Patsy said. I know, Eli said. She's always okay. He opened his notebook and went back to drawing. Outside, the last light left the sky above the ridge, and Harlan County settled into its summer dark, and 40 acres of hill country farm waited in the distance for whatever was coming to be met. The farm road from the highway was 3/4 of a mile of gravel and packed clay banked on both sides by wire fence, strung between cedar posts, the fence posts leaning at the angles of things that had been standing in the same ground for 30 years. Ruth knew every inch of it in the way that people know the things they have moved through repeatedly, in every weather and every light and no light at all. She had driven it in snowstorms, in mud so deep the truck fishtailed the entire length, in August heat when the gravel threw the sun back in your face. Tonight she drove it in the dark of a June evening, with the headlights on and the window cracked, and the sound of Harley engines surrounding her truck on all sides like a living escort. Dax rode directly ahead. 2 other Iron Covenant members rode at the flanks, close enough that their headlights swept across the fence line on either side. Behind the truck, the rest of the convoy stretched back to the highway, a line of moving lights in the side mirror. Ruth had driven with an escort exactly once before in her life when they brought Earl home from the hospital for the last time, and the funeral home had provided a car to follow the ambulance. This was nothing like that, and yet it rhymed with it in some way she could not quite name, the sense of being carried by something larger than herself toward a destination she could not fully see. She drove without hurrying. Hurrying would not change what was at the farm, and it would not improve the condition of the road at night, and she had found in her 68 years that most situations benefit more from composure than from speed. The farmhouse was dark when they came around the last curve, and the property opened up ahead of them. The house, the barn, the equipment shed to the east, the pasture running back to the tree line, dark except for the east fence where there was light. Flashlight beams moving, and beyond them the pale, oblong shape of a pickup truck parked on the verge just outside the gate. Dax raised one hand and the convoy slowed. The bikers spread out as they came to a stop, not in a line, but in a loose arc the way they had clearly done this kind of thing before, containing a scene without charging into it. Ruth stopped her truck and got out. 3 men. That was what Floyd had said, and Floyd had been right. 2 of them were standing at the gate, one of them holding bolt cutters in both hands, as if he hadn't quite decided what to do with them yet. The third was leaning against the fender of the pickup with his arms crossed, in the manner of someone who expects his authority to do most of his work for him. He was perhaps 50 soft across the middle, wearing a collared shirt with a company logo on the breast pocket that Ruth could not read from this distance. He had the look of a man who delivered bad news for a living and had stopped feeling bad about it. The bolt cutter man and his companion had not expected 34 motorcycles to materialize out of the dark. They had expected Ruth suspected to find one elderly woman who would read their papers and look frightened and not know what to do. The collared shirt man recovered fastest. He pushed off the fender and held up a manila envelope. "Mrs. Carver," he said, addressing the area generally, since she had not yet announced herself. "That's me," Ruth said, walking toward him. He had the flat, pleasant manner of someone who has been trained to be inoffensive while delivering offensive information. "Ma'am, my name is Curtis. I'm with the Process Division of Harlan Land Holdings. I have here a notice of default judgment and an order of possession signed by Judge Gerald Hogan of the county court. This property is subject to foreclosure proceedings as of—" "Show me," Ruth said. He extended the envelope. She opened it and stood in the headlights of 3 motorcycles to read it. It was a legal document. It looked correct. It cited a mortgage held by First Community Bank of Harlan County, referenced 4 missed payments beginning in the previous November, and bore the signature of Judge Gerald Hogan at the bottom notarized. It named the property by its parcel number, which Ruth knew by memory because Earl had made her memorize it when they refinanced 12 years ago, and the parcel number matched. Ruth read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope. She stood in the headlights of 3 motorcycles in the dark of a June evening on the land her husband had paid for with the years of his body, and she held the document that said it was not hers, and she felt the particular quality of anger that comes not from being wronged in the moment, but from recognizing the calculation behind the wrong. This was not impulsive. This was planned. Someone had spent months arranging these pieces: the bank sale, the altered terms, the judge, with the specific intention of arriving at this night, this door, this elderly woman alone on her property who was supposed to take the paper and go pale and not know what to do. They had not accounted for the fact that Ruth Carver had stood at harder doors than this one and had not moved. "I haven't missed a payment," she said. "Not one. 14 years of payments on this mortgage, and I have not missed one. Ma'am, the bank's records show—" "I don't care what the bank's records show," Ruth said without heat, without anything in her voice that could be called anger. "My records show something different, and my records are correct." She paused. "What bank, First Community, sold this mortgage 3 years ago? To who?" Curtis's pleasant expression did not waver. "The note was acquired by Harlan Land Holdings 18 months ago as part of a portfolio purchase. So the company you work for holds the mortgage you're claiming I defaulted on. That's not unusual in the mortgage servicing industry, ma'am." "No," Ruth said. "It's not unusual at all." She looked at the document again. "This order gives me until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to vacate." "Yes, ma'am. And if I don't, law enforcement will assist in effecting the transfer of possession." Ruth was quiet for a moment, standing in the dark with her farm behind her, and a manila envelope in her hand, and the sounds of a June night crickets, a whippoorwill somewhere in the timber, the faint creak sound from the east pasture. She had grown up on this land. Earl had grown up a mile from it. They had poured 40 years of their combined lives into the soil and the fences and the structures and the working of it. And she was being told by a man in a collared shirt that she had until 9 in the morning. Dax had walked up beside her. He had not said anything. He was reading the document over her shoulder without asking, which was a presumption she found she did not mind. He said quietly to her only, "May I?" She handed him the document. He took it and walked back toward a group of 4 bikers who were apparently the people he thought through problems with. And Ruth watched them huddle over the pages in the headlight glare, while Curtis stood with his arms starting to recross. The 2 men at the gate had set down the bolt cutters. The gate was still locked. They had not gotten through it. Ruth noticed this and felt a small, cold satisfaction. "You won't need those tonight," she said to the one who had been holding them. He looked at his hands and then looked away. Dax came back. He spoke quietly. "The parcel number is right. The judge's signature I can't verify here. But I know Gerald Hogan. He's been on that bench 11 years, and he's had his hand in Harlan Land Holdings matters before, 2 other properties east of town in the last 4 years. Both small landowners, both pushed out. Our attorney has those cases." He paused. "If I call Franklin Pierce tonight, he can look at this and tell us in an hour what we're working with." "It's nearly 9 o'clock, Ruth said. "Franklin doesn't keep regular hours. He keeps necessary hours." Dax looked at her steadily. "But it needs to be your call. This is your property and your fight." Ruth looked at him. She looked at the men at the gate and the man in the collared shirt and the manila envelope in Dax's hand. She looked at her farmhouse, dark and quiet against the tree line, the place where Earl had died in the bed they'd shared for 31 years, the place where Eli came in the summer to slow down, the place where she had learned every creek and tree and fence post, and the way the morning light came in the east window of the kitchen in October when the angle was just right. "Call your attorney," she said. Dax turned and made the call. Ruth walked to the gate. She unlocked it herself, swung it open, and walked to the house. She turned on the porch light and the kitchen light and the light in the front room, and the farmhouse lit up in sections, warm against the dark. And from the road it was possible to see that whatever these men had expected tonight, a woman who turned her lights on and put a kettle on and moved through her own home with the calm ownership of 40 years, was not it. Curtis and his men waited. They had no immediate legal authority to enter. The order was for 9 in the morning, not tonight. They stood by their truck and they waited. And the 32 members of Iron Covenant who were not standing in Ruth's kitchen also waited, distributed along the fence line and the road headlights angled outward. A quiet and comprehensive presence that made the patch of road in front of Ruth Carver's farm feel like the least hospitable stretch of ground in Harlan County to anyone arriving with bad intentions. Inside the kitchen, Ruth made coffee. She made enough for a crowd because she understood that there would be a crowd, and because the practical management of a situation, even a serious one, maybe especially a serious one, requires that people be fed and watered and kept capable of thought. The gray-bearded biker, his name was Otis Armstrong, she would learn later, and he had been with Iron Covenant 27 years, came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted a mug without ceremony. A younger man named Knox Dalton stood in the doorway to the back of the house with his arms folded, watching the hall because someone had determined that someone should watch the hall, and he had determined it would be him. Dax came in last. He had been outside on the phone. He sat down across from Ruth and put the document on the table between them and said, "Franklin is looking at it now. He'll call back." What does he think so far? He thinks the claimed default looks irregular. The payment schedule in the document doesn't match the refinancing terms he pulled up on the county recorder's site. Someone either made an error or made a choice, and in his experience with Harlan Land Holdings, it was not an error. Dax paused. He also says Judge Hogan signed this order without requiring any documentation of the default. That's not standard practice. Normally, you'd see affidavits, bank statements, something. This is a one-page order with a signature. Ruth wrapped her hands around her mug. How long has Harlan Land Holdings been working on this? Franklin thinks at least 6 months, maybe longer. They don't move fast, they move carefully. This kind of operation requires the cooperation of at least a county recorder who doesn't ask questions, and a judge who doesn't either. He looked at her. Your land sits on a ridge above an identified shale formation. There's been interest in that formation for 2 years. Your property is the last piece they'd need to complete a land assembly for access drilling. Earl's land, Ruth said. Earl worked in the mines for 30 years, worked in coal country his whole life, gave his lungs to it, and now they want the land he bought with what was left over. Otis at the table said nothing, but his jaw was tight. You said you know about 2 other cases, Ruth said to Dax. East of town, Walter Briggs, no relation to Wade, lost his property 2 years ago. His mortgage note was also acquired, also claimed default, also Judge Hogan. Dax paused. Walter moved to his daughter's place in Ohio. He didn't fight it because he didn't know it could be fought. Ruth looked at the table. She had lived in Harlan County her entire life, and she had watched the county change. The mines close, the young people leave, the tax base erode, the services contract. She had watched the small grocery close, and the school consolidate, and the clinic where she had once worked shuttered. She had told herself that things changed, and you adjusted, and that was the nature of time. But this was not time. This was deliberate. This was specific people making specific decisions to take the land of people who had already given everything they had to this county and had nothing left to give except the land itself. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I have the original deed. I have every mortgage payment receipt Earl saved from the day we took out that loan. He saved everything. He was that kind of man. Meticulous. Every statement, every receipt, every letter. He kept them in a fireproof box in the equipment shed. Dax looked at her. Is the shed locked? There's a padlock on the door. Same key as the house key. She paused. If they knew about the box, they might, Dax said carefully. Ruth stood. I'm going to get it. I'll come with you. You don't need to, Mrs. Carver. Something in his voice made her stop. He said it quietly, seriously, not as a threat and not as a suggestion. 3 men came to your property with bolt cutters tonight. The box you're describing is the thing that can undo what they've built for 6 months. I'm not letting you walk out to that shed alone. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her mug, finished the last of the coffee, and set it down. Then come along, she said, and bring Knox. They went out through the back door into the warm Kentucky night, Ruth leading with a flashlight because she knew where she was going, and the light only made it easier. The equipment shed was 40 feet east of the house, its sheet metal walls warm to the touch from the day's heat. Ruth unlocked the padlock, swung the door, and the smell of oil and old wood, and the particular metal smell of farm equipment hit her as it always did, familiar as a handshake. The fireproof box was in the back corner under the workbench, behind a set of tire chains Earl had kept even after they had the tractor with the chains built in, because he believed in redundancy. Ruth dragged it out. It was heavier than she remembered. Dax lifted it the rest of the way without being asked, which she allowed. She unlocked it with a small key on her keychain. Inside, organized in the careful way of a man who trusted nothing to memory, were 40 years of paper. Deed, mortgage note in original terms. Payment receipts, every one organized by year in labeled envelopes. Letters from the bank. Tax receipts. The certificate of refinancing from 12 years ago. Everything. There, she said. Knox crouched and looked. This is what they came for, he said quietly. Not tonight, they didn't know the schedule. But if this had been here tomorrow when the order went through, it would have disappeared, Dax said. He looked at Ruth. We need to get this to Franklin tonight. I can photograph everything, Ruth said. Send it digitally. Better than that, Knox can ride to Lexington with the originals. He'll be there by midnight. Knox nodded without hesitation. Already on it. Ruth stood in her equipment shed with the fireproof box in Dax Steele's hands, and she thought about Earl keeping every receipt, every letter, every statement for 30-plus years because he was that kind of man, methodical and careful and trusting nothing to chance. And she thought, Earl, you stubborn, careful, perfect man. Even gone, you are still protecting this place. She did not say it, she thought it. And then she thought a second thing, which was this, that the most consequential acts of a person's life are usually invisible to them as they perform them. Earl had not saved every receipt because he was preparing for fraud. He had saved every receipt because that was how he approached things, with the particular care of a man who had grown up without margin, who had learned young that the difference between a thing recorded and a thing forgotten was the difference between a thing proved and a thing lost. He had built his careful habits over 60 years without knowing they were building toward this night. And she had opened a door in Pikeville 14 years ago without knowing it was building toward this night either. And now here were the two things together, his careful paper and her open door standing between a corrupt company and the farm they had built together. And she thought that was the most Earl thing she could imagine, that he would protect this place even from the other side of the 3 years he had been gone. All right, she said, let's get it copied and get Knox on the road. They went back to the house. Curtis and his 2 men were still at the road. Outside, Iron Covenant's presence was unchanged, patient, comprehensive, unmoved. The night was settling in for the long hours before morning, and Ruth Carver made more coffee and spread Earl's papers on the kitchen table under the overhead light. And the process of building the defense against what was coming began one document at a time in a farmhouse kitchen in Harlan County, Kentucky, with the sound of 34 motorcycle engines waiting quiet in the dark. Knox left at 10:15, the box of documents secured in his saddlebag, riding east into the dark. Ruth watched him go from the porch with her arms crossed and the cooling night air on her face. And then she went back inside. The kitchen had settled into the rhythm of a long wait. Otis had helped himself to a second cup of coffee. Dax was at the table reviewing the photographs of the documents they had taken before Knox left his reading glasses, which he produced from a vest pocket with the slight self-consciousness of a man who associates needing reading glasses with a particular kind of vulnerability perched on the bridge of his nose. 3 other bikers had come inside and were distributed around the kitchen with the quiet courtesy of men who were guests and knew it. The rest maintained their positions outside. Ruth sat down at the table. She did not look at the documents. She had looked at them all her life. Instead, she looked at the kitchen itself, the marks on the doorframe where she and Earl had measured Nora's height every birthday until she went to college. The hook by the back door where Earl's coat had hung for 20 years, and where now her coat hung. The window above the sink that faced east and caught the first light of every morning. You should rest, Dax said without looking up. I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. I said you should rest. I've done nights before, plenty of them. So have I. He did look up then. But you have to be clear-headed tomorrow morning at 9. That's when this matters most. Tonight we can watch. Ruth considered this. It was sound reasoning. She did not like it, which was different from it being wrong. The couch, she said finally. I'm not going upstairs. I want to hear if anything changes. Dax nodded. Otis quietly got up and brought a folded blanket from the back room. He must have found the linen closet, which was where it always was, and set it on the couch without comment. Ruth stretched out on the couch, the blanket across her legs, and listened to the kitchen sounds. The occasional low voice, the creak of a chair, the distant sound of a motorcycle idling briefly and then stopping. The night noises of her farm underneath it all, the creak, the timber, the whippoorwill. She did not expect to sleep. She slept within 10 minutes, the deep and immediate sleep of a woman whose body understood that rest was a form of preparation. At the kitchen table, Dax Steele sat with Earl Carver's papers and his reading glasses and a cold cup of coffee, and he read until he understood the shape of what had been built against this woman over 6 months, and the shape of what might be used to tear it down. Outside, 33 members of Iron Covenant kept their positions in the dark, and the June night moved around them, and the farm held its ground the way farms do, patient specific, rooted in exactly one piece of earth and not willing to be anywhere else. Dax read through the contents of Earl Carver's box with the steady attention of a man who has learned to find the shape of a problem by understanding its edges. The payment receipts were organized by year each year in its own envelope labeled in Earl's block lettering, and the receipts themselves were precise: date, amount, bank stamp, everything a person would need to demonstrate that a payment had been made on a specific day. The original mortgage note was there, and the refinancing certificate, and the deed with its parcel number and acreage, and the names Earl and Ruth Carver typed in the spaces where names go. He spread these documents across the kitchen table, and he put the Harlan Land Holdings version beside them, and he looked at the two payment schedules side by side for a long time. The 10-day shift was subtle. It would not be obvious to someone who had only one document. It was only visible when you had both the original and the altered, and could see the particular way the November due date had been moved forward by precisely enough to transform a timely payment into a late one. Someone had been very careful. Someone had made a very specific choice. Dax sat with that choice in front of him, and he felt the cold anger of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and knows exactly what it costs the people it is done to. Franklin Pierce called at 12:47 in the morning. Dax was still at the kitchen table. He had not slept and had not expected to. He answered on the first ring, and Ruth, who had been more aware of the kitchen sounds than she realized, opened her eyes on the couch at the sound of his voice. "Franklin," Dax said. Then he listened for a long time, and Ruth watched his face. A person's face when they are receiving information over the phone is a partial text readable only if you know the person. Ruth did not know Dax Steele, but she had 22 years of reading people in compressed circumstances, the particular ability of nurses to take in a face and extract the essential from it. What she read in his face now was confirmation, not surprise. The kind of gravity that belongs to a man being told that what he suspected is in fact what is true. He said, "All of it," and then 14%, and then a long pause. The note itself. And then after a longer pause, "Yes, 6 hours." He hung up. He set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Ruth. "The mortgage note in that document," he said, "has a different payment schedule than the original note. Specifically, the November payment date is moved up by 10 days from what the original agreement specified. That 10-day discrepancy means the November payment, which you made on time per the original schedule, was technically late by the altered schedule's terms. The other three claimed missed payments have the same structure. It's done very carefully. The changes are not obvious on a document-by-document basis. Franklin only caught it because he had the original refinancing terms from the county recorder and could compare them side by side. Ruth was sitting up now. The blanket had fallen to the floor. Someone altered the note. Yes, after First Community sold it to Harlan Land Holdings, which means someone at Harlan Land Holdings altered the servicing terms of an existing mortgage instrument and then used the altered version to secure a court order. He paused. That is fraud. Multiple counts. And the judge, Franklin looked at the property tax filings. Gerald Hogan holds a 14% stake in Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. Copper Ridge Partners, LLC is the majority stakeholder in Harlan Land Holdings. Dax looked at her steadily. A judge cannot sign a foreclosure order on a property that directly benefits a company he holds equity in. That's a textbook conflict of interest. The order is void on its face. Ruth absorbed this. Outside, the night made its night sounds, and she could hear the very faint creak of a motorcycle settling on its stand somewhere near the east fence. "How long to bring this before a court that can act on it?" she said. "Franklin wants to file in federal district court at opening. 7:30, 8 o'clock. He can get an emergency stay, a temporary order preventing any action on the county order until the conflict of interest question is resolved. The fraudulent alteration is a separate track, takes longer, But the conflict of interest on Hogan's part is immediate and straightforward. He looked at the clock on the wall. Knox is in Lexington now. He called half an hour ago. Franklin has the originals. Ruth looked at the clock. 1 in the morning. 8 hours. 8 hours before the 9 o'clock deadline, and within that, some smaller number of hours in which a federal court needed to open, and a filing needed to be accepted, and an emergency order needed to be granted. Can he do it? Ruth said. Franklin has done it before. He's fast and he doesn't panic. Dax paused. And he doesn't like Harlan Land Holdings. They've cost him 2 cases he should have won because the other side had Hogan. He'll take particular satisfaction in this one. Ruth stood up from the couch. She was stiff. The couch was too short for her by 4 inches, and always had been, and sleeping on it had never been comfortable. But she had done it through all of Eli's childhood illnesses, when she'd wanted to be near the front of the house in case he called in the night. What do we do until then? She said. We wait, Dax said, and we make sure nothing happens to this house or this property between now and when that filing goes through. Ruth looked at him. You've been awake this whole time. So have you. Mostly. You've been here since 9 o'clock at night. Yes. She went to the kitchen. She made eggs. She made them in the cast iron skillet that had been her mother's, and before that her grandmother's, the iron so seasoned with 50 years of use that it was nearly non-stick. And she made enough eggs for however many people were in her kitchen, plus the handful she was going to carry out to whoever was on watch at the gate. She made toast. She made it without asking who wanted what, and without apologizing for the hour. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and eggs and toast, and the bikers at her kitchen table ate with the straightforward gratitude of hungry men who had not expected to be fed. Dax ate without comment and without ceremony, and she thought again that Earl would have liked him. They did not talk about what was coming. They talked about other things. She asked Otis how long he had ridden, and he said 27 years. And she asked how far, and he said he had stopped counting miles and started counting states, which was more satisfying, and he was on 41. She told him that Earl had wanted to ride, had talked about it, had never gotten around to it, and Otis said that was the way of it sometimes. The things people meant to do had a way of waiting longer than the people did. He said it without sentiment as a plain fact, and she received it the same way. She carried a plate and coffee to the gate at 2 in the morning. The men on watch took it with the minimal ceremony of people who are cold and grateful. She stood with them for a few minutes looking at the road. Curtis's truck was gone. She had not noticed it leave, but it was gone now. They'll be back, one of the bikers said. He was perhaps 35, dark-bearded, a scar across his chin that matched Dax's in no particular, but reminded her of it. With Keller, probably. Keller's the sheriff. He and Hogan go back 20 years. I know Ray Keller, Ruth said. He came to Earl's funeral, shook my hand and told me what a good man Earl was. The bearded biker looked at her. He didn't say anything, but she read his face, and yet, here we are. Yes, Ruth said as if he had spoken. And yet, here we are. She went back to the house. At 3:14 in the morning, she heard a sound. She was in the kitchen, at the table, not sleeping, when it came not from the front of the property, but from behind the house, from the direction of the equipment shed. A sharp sound, brief, the kind of sound that might have been an animal or might have been a latch. Ruth was out the back door before the thought fully formed. She moved in the dark without a flashlight. She knew the distance in the ground, and she was 20 feet from the equipment shed when she smelled it. Smoke. Not much of it yet. The thin, acrid smell of something igniting that should not be igniting, the smell that every rural person knows as the smell that requires running, not walking. The back wall of the shed was showing orange through the gap between the wall and the foundation. Someone had gotten fire to the dry grass against the back wall, and the grass had taken the wood, and the wood was beginning to go. Ruth did not stand and think. She went to the water trough 20 feet away, Earl's horse trough always full from the downhill spigot, and she had the 5-gallon bucket that lived beside it in her hands before she had completed the thought. And she was throwing water on the base of the shed wall, before anyone from the house had reached her. She threw the first bucket, went back for the second. The fire was not large, yet whoever had set it had been interrupted by the presence of Iron Covenant and had had to work quickly in the dark, and the water was taking effect. She could hear people running now from the house, from the fence line. She threw the third bucket. The fourth. Her left hand was close to the wall when she threw the fifth, and the embers caught her wrist. Not the fire itself, just the edge of it. A flare of heat that she felt across the back of her hand and lower arm. She stepped back automatically, the way a person steps back from something hot, and threw the sixth bucket one-handed. Dax was beside her. He had a second bucket, and he was working the same point she had been working, and two other bikers had a coil of hose from somewhere, and the water pressure of the farmyard spigot was engaged, and they were working methodically down the base of the wall, smothering, soaking, removing the conditions for fire. The way you remove the conditions for anything systematically without panic. It took 6 minutes. At the end of 6 minutes, there was no fire, only the smell of smoke and wet char, and the acrid remains of the grass that had carried the initial flame. Dax turned to look at Ruth. He saw her hand. It was not severe. She would know a severe burn. She had treated them. The skin across the back of her left hand and the lower 2 inches of her wrist was red, the particular deep red of a contact burn, and it was beginning to hurt in the way burns begin to hurt, when the initial shock steps back and lets the nerves have their say. She had first-degree burn on the wrist and a small patch of second-degree blistered, already a thumbnail-sized area where the embers had been hottest. Medical kit, Dax said to no one in particular. I have one, Ruth said. In the house. Left cabinet above the refrigerator. One of the bikers was already moving toward the house. I'm fine, Ruth said. You have a burn, Dax said. I know what I have. I treated burns for 20 years. But she let him walk her back toward the house because her hand was beginning to speak to her with the particular insistence of something that wants attention. Inside the kitchen, under the overhead light, she dressed the burn herself, which she insisted on because she knew how to do it, and because there was something difficult about being tended when you were accustomed to tending. The second-degree patch she covered with nonstick gauze and secured with medical tape. The rest she treated with cool water and let breathe. Dax watched. He did not offer help. He understood, which was not the same as approving. There was only one of them, said Knox, who was back from Lexington, had arrived 40 minutes before while Ruth slept. He was standing in the doorway, hands on his belt. I went around the back, found where he came through the fence on the north side. Small hole pried staples. He ran when he heard us coming, but he got the fire started first. Did you see him? Dax said. Enough to say, young, probably not the same three from earlier. They hired someone local who knows the property. Knox paused. Boss, they knew about the shed. Ruth finished taping the gauze. She looked at her hand. The tattoo on her wrist, the cross, and the change, the cracked vertical bar, was just below the burn, undamaged. They knew about the box, she said. Not the shed specifically. If I keep important papers in the house or somewhere on the property, the logical place is not the house, too exposed. A locked outbuilding. They were trying to eliminate whatever documentation I might have. She paused. They didn't know Knox had already taken it. They don't know about Franklin, Dax said. No, Ruth looked up. They think they've covered everything. Papers, altered judge, paid order in hand, and now the evidence burned. She paused. They're planning on walking in at 9 o'clock to find an old woman with nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. The box is in Lexington, Knox said. Franklin has photographed everything and filed it. The originals are in his office safe. Then we have what we need, Ruth said. Now we wait for morning. Dax looked at her hand, then at her face. She met his eyes with the expression she had worn in every hard situation she could remember. Not defiance, which is a cousin of fear, but a quiet and thorough refusal to be moved. Rest, he said. I mean it this time. I will, she said. But first tell me about Wade Briggs in Colorado. Tell me about the horses. Dax looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down. And he told her. He told her that Wade had left the road 2 years ago, Not because anything had forced him off it, but because something had pulled him away. A piece of land in the San Luis Valley, flat and wide and backed by the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that he had passed through on a ride and had felt in the way that certain places make themselves known, was where he was meant to stop. He raised quarter horses. He had a daughter who visited in the summers, the same daughter he had talked about on Ruth's kitchen table 14 years ago in Pikeville, while she worked to keep his blood inside his body. The daughter was 22 now and in college in Denver, and she came in August, and they rode together in the early morning when the valley was still cold, and the mountains were a clean, pale color against the sky. He told Ruth that Wade talked about her every year when the club gathered, that there had never been a year since Pikeville when Wade had not mentioned Ruth Carver, and that the men who had been there long enough to have heard the story more than once did not mind hearing it again, because it was one of those stories that did not wear thin. Ruth listened. She sat at the kitchen table with her bandaged hand in her lap, and she listened and the hours moved. At 6:30 in the morning, Franklin Pierce called. The filing had been accepted at the federal court's emergency docket. The duty judge had reviewed the conflict of interest documentation and had issued a temporary restraining order preventing execution of the county foreclosure pending a full hearing on the merits. The TRO was in effect as of 6:45 in the morning. Gerald Hogan's order was, as of that moment, unenforceable. Dax told Ruth. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What about the fraud?" "Franklin's referring that to the state attorney general's office. It'll take time, weeks, maybe months, but the documentary evidence is strong. The altered payment schedule, compared against the original terms, is not subtle once you put the two documents side by side." He paused. "Harlan Land Holdings has done this before and gotten away with it because the previous targets didn't have documentation and didn't have a lawyer who moved this fast. You had both." Ruth looked at the kitchen window. The sky to the east was lightening the deep blue of the hour before the sun, the light coming first to the top of the ridge and filtering down. In 40 minutes, it would reach the kitchen window. "Earl saved every receipt," she said. "Yes. He said once that paper was proof that something happened. That memory was just a story you told yourself, but paper was the thing that actually occurred." She looked at the window. He was right. At 7 o'clock, Ruth went to the east pasture with a cup of coffee and stood in the wet grass and watched the sunrise. The mountains to the east caught the first real light, the ridgeline going from black to a deep, vivid green, and then the sun cleared the ridge, and the pasture was gold for 20 minutes, the dew on the grass turning to light, the tree line at the far end of the field becoming specific and particular as the light reached it. Dax found her there. He stood beside her and did not say anything. "Earl and I stood here every clear morning," Ruth said. "Not every morning, but the clear ones. We stood here and watched it come up, and then we went back and made breakfast and started the day." She was quiet. "I don't watch it alone if I can help it, but I don't not watch it." Dax said nothing. He drank his coffee. He stood beside her and watched the light move down the pasture. At 8:15, the convoy arrived. 2 black SUVs, a Harlan Land Holdings Company truck, and behind them a county sheriff's cruiser, 1, then 2, then a third driving in formation. Ray Keller got out of the lead cruiser. He was a large man, gray-haired, in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had held authority long enough to confuse it with his personality. He wore his uniform with the careful pressedness of a man who needed to be taken seriously. Behind him from the SUVs came 3 men in suits, one of whom Ruth recognized as Curtis, and 2 others she had not seen before. From the company truck came 4 more men, these ones wearing work clothes and carrying equipment, orange cones, survey stakes, and what looked like a lockbox. Ruth was on her porch. She had put on clean clothes, the same jeans, a different flannel shirt, her good boots. Her left hand was bandaged, and she did not hide it, and she did not display it. Eli was inside, at her instruction, but she had told him he could watch from the front window, and she could feel his presence at the glass behind her. In the road in front of the property, in a line that stretched from gate to driveway, stood 34 members of Iron Covenant. They had not made a formation, had not rehearsed anything. They were simply standing in the particular way that large men in leather stand when they have decided on something not aggressive, not theatrical, just present, and present in a way that was its own kind of statement. Keller looked at them. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked at Ruth. "Mrs. Carver," he said, "I have a court order requiring your vacating of this property by 9 a.m. "I know about that order," Ruth said. "Then you understand. I understand that it's been superseded by a federal restraining order filed at 6:45 this morning." Ruth held up the document. Franklin had emailed it, and she had printed it on the old inkjet printer in the back room, the one she used for farm records. "If you'd like to read it, you're welcome. It prohibits any action on Judge Hogan's order pending a federal hearing on a conflict of interest complaint. Hogan holds equity in Harlan Land Holdings. He cannot sign foreclosure orders on their behalf." Keller's face went through several things in quick succession. Ruth watched them happen. One of the suited men came forward, reached for the document. Ruth held it out. He took it. His eyes moved through it, and she watched his face do the same things Keller's had done, only faster and with more familiarity with what he was reading. He turned to Keller and said something quietly. Keller's jaw tightened further. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Iron Covenant. Curtis, standing beside the company truck, had not moved. He had the look of a man who had delivered bad news long enough to recognize the moment when the bad news was coming for him instead. Keller turned to speak to the suited man. The suited man shook his head once, a short and definitive motion. Dax stood 2 feet to Ruth's left. He had not said a word. He was not going to say a word unless Keller did something that required a response. Ruth had told him this, and he had accepted it because it was her property and her fight, and he was here to stand and not to speak. Keller looked at the federal order one more time. Then he looked at Ruth. "This isn't over," he said. Ruth met his eyes with the same directness she had used on 4 men looking for a dying biker in the dark, 14 years and several hundred miles from here. "No," she said, "it's just beginning, but it's not beginning with me leaving my property." Ray Keller got back in his cruiser. The suited men got back in their SUVs. Curtis got in the company truck. They pulled out of the driveway one by one, and then they were on the road, and then they were gone around the curve, and the sound of their engines faded. Ruth stood on her porch for a long moment after the sound was gone. The morning light was full, now golden and clear, and her 40 acres were green around her, the pasture wet with dew, the timber line at the far end of the property dark and still. The kitchen window showed the faint shape of Eli watching from inside. She exhaled. She had not known until that moment how much she had been holding. Not the fear exactly. She had not been afraid in the sharp, immediate way that fear presents itself, because she had been too focused on the next required thing to have room for it. But something adjacent to fear, something in the same family, the particular bodily tension of a person who has been prepared for a long time for something that has not yet arrived, and whose body does not release that preparation until the moment of resolution comes. She felt it leave her now, from the shoulders downward, a slow unclenching that moved through her like the letting out of a breath held since the previous night. Earl's land, still hers. The document in her hand confirmed it. The men driving away down the county road confirmed it. The 34 people standing behind her confirmed it in the way that physical presence confirms things, not through argument, but through the simple fact of being there. Dax said quietly, "It holds." "For now," Ruth said. "For now is enough." From behind her, the kitchen door opened, and Eli came out at a run, barefoot on the porch boards, and he hit her side at full speed and wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face in her flannel shirt. She put her good hand on his hair. "Did they leave?" he said muffled. "They left. Is it over?" "The morning part is over." She stroked his hair. "There's still more to do, but the farm is still ours." Eli pulled back and looked at her face. He was still young enough that he did not try to be composed about things that frightened him, and she could see that he had been frightened. She did not tell him he shouldn't have been. She just looked at him steadily, the same way she had looked at patients who needed to know they were seen. "I knew you'd be okay," he said. And then because he was 10 and therefore honest, "I was still scared." "Those things can both be true," Ruth said. Eli nodded. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. Then he looked past her at Iron Covenant, still ranged along the road, and something shifted in his face, the particular shift of a child moving from fear to wonder, which is one of the best transitions a face can make. "Bah," he said. "They all stayed." They did. All night. All night. Eli looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at Ruth's bandaged hand, which he had not noticed until now. His face tightened again. "You're hurt. It's minor. I'll show you how to treat a burn later. Good thing to know." He looked at her hand and then at her face, and then back at the road where Dax was walking toward them, and the mornings settled around the farm, in the way mornings settle light and quiet and specific belonging to exactly this place. 3 days passed. The federal TRO held. Harlan Land Holdings made no further overt moves against the property, though Dax's network reported that the company's legal team had been in a series of closed meetings with their principal officers, the kind of meetings that happen when an organization realizes the ground has shifted under them. Gerald Hogan had not appeared on the county court bench since the day of the TRO. His clerk had issued a terse statement saying the judge was taking a leave of absence. Franklin Pierce, when he heard this, had called Dax and said simply, "He's lawyering up." Ray Keller had driven past the farm 3 times in the subsequent days, once in the early morning and twice in the afternoon. Each time at least 4 Iron Covenant motorcycles were visible from the road, either in the driveway or along the fence line. Each time Keller's cruiser slowed but did not stop and continued on. "He's watching to see if we leave," Dax said. "Do we leave?" Ruth asked. "Not yet," Dax said. "You've been here 3 days. We've been in worse places for longer." Ruth did not argue. She had accepted some time in the second day that arguing about this was a kind of waste that she could not afford, and that the presence of Iron Covenant on her property was practically speaking the most effective deterrent available to her against a further attempt to act on the fraudulent order or to otherwise destabilize her position. She was too practical to reject effective deterrence on the grounds that she felt she should not need it. She had instead found ways to make the 3 days useful. She gave the bikers tasks, not because they needed direction, but because her instinct developed over decades was that people in a sustained waiting situation needed productive engagement. She had pointed Knox at the equipment shed repairs, the back wall had charring that needed to come off, and new siding that needed to go on. And he had organized 3 others into a crew that finished the job in the better part of a day. She had asked Otis, because he had mentioned his history in farming, to help her assess the north fence that had needed attention since spring, and he had done it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that a fence was a functional object and not a cosmetic one. Eli had attached himself to Knox with a single-mindedness that children reserve for adults who speak to them as if their interest and intelligence are worth addressing. Knox had apparently decided without discussion that Eli was worth the investment of serious conversation, and the 2 of them had spent large parts of 2 days in the barn and around the farm, with Knox explaining the mechanical operation of things, and Eli asking the particular kind of questions that reveal a mind working to connect new information to existing understanding, rather than merely collecting facts. Ruth watched this from the kitchen doorway and thought about the way that useful people find each other across age and circumstance, and the way a child who needed to be taken seriously had found in the middle of a frightening week an adult who did exactly that. The second evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling dark, Ruth told Dax about Earl. She told him about the 31 years, the specific texture of a long marriage, the way it contained whole seasons of ease and whole seasons of friction, and the way those things were not opposed but interwoven, the way you could not have had the ease without the friction or the friction without the ease. She told him about the mines and what they had cost Earl over 30 years, the incremental accumulation of damage that had become finally inescapable. She told him about the last 2 years of Earl's life, which had been hard in a way that she did not minimize, but did not dwell on, because dwelling was not her character, and because the last 2 years were not the only years. She told him about the morning Earl had first walked her to the east pasture to watch the sun come up over the ridge, in the first summer they had owned the farm 30 years ago. She told him that was still, all these years later, the image she kept of him, not the last years, not the hospital, but that morning Earl standing in the wet grass with his coffee, the light coming down the ridge, his face open and uncomplicated in the way his face was when something was simply and purely good. Dax listened. He listened the way good listeners listen, which is without filling the silences. When she was done, he said, "My wife is in Knoxville. We've been separated 2 years. Not divorced yet, not sure whether that's optimism or avoidance." A pause. "She got tired of me being on the road, which is fair. I got tired of feeling like the road was a choice I'd made against something else, which is also fair." He paused again. "The road was not a choice I made against her, but I made it, and she was the thing I made it against. And those aren't the same thing, but they feel the same from the outside." Ruth considered this. "You could go back. I don't know whether going back is the right thing or just the easiest thing. And I've found that I make bad decisions when I can't tell those apart." He looked at the dark above the ridge. "Wade got off the road and found the horses. Maybe that's the model. Find the horses." "What would your horses be?" Ruth said. Dax was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "Maybe that's the work." Ruth looked at the dark and thought that this was in fact the work for most people most of the time, figuring out what the horses were, and that the people who found them were lucky, and the people who kept looking had integrity, and the people who stopped looking and settled for something lesser were simply tired, which was understandable, which was human, which was not the same as right. She did not say any of this. She said, "The offer stands for the east pasture if you want to watch the sun come up." Dax looked at her. "Tomorrow morning, clear weather," she said. "I watch it most clear mornings." "Then I'll be there," he said. He was. They stood in the wet grass at 6:15, coffee in hand, and watched the ridgeline go from black to green. And Eli was there too, in his pajamas, with his bare feet in the grass, not talking, just watching, which was the appropriate response. It was in this context, three people in a wet pasture, watching the light, that Franklin Pierce called with the news about the case expanding significantly. Walter Briggs had kept his box. Franklin had been in contact with him and his daughter Helen, who had driven up from Chillicothe with the documents, and Franklin had spent the previous night reviewing the contents with two associates. The results were consistent with what they had found in Ruth's case payment schedule, altered by 10 days creating a false default. Same forgery of the servicing agreement, same signature from Gerald Hogan on the resulting order. "Same hand," Franklin said. "Same alteration method. The state AG's office received this, and they are moving significantly faster than I expected. I think they had more than they told me. I think Ruth's case was the thing that let them move on a file they already had most of." "So it gets better for Ruth," Dax said. "Significantly. The AG's involvement means federal attention as well. And federal attention means Harlan Land Holdings is looking at charges that go well above county court jurisdiction. At this point, I would expect them to approach Ruth's legal situation with a settlement offer within 30 days. He paused again. "And Walter Briggs may get his property back." "How many cases?" Ruth said. She had taken the phone back. "We know of 4, including yours. There may be more. The AG is still pulling records." Ruth was quiet, standing in the east pasture, with the sunlight reaching her face. 4 properties, 4 families. One of them, Walter Briggs, who had packed up and gone to his daughter's place in Ohio because he hadn't known it could be fought. "Find them all," Ruth said. "That's the intention," Franklin said. She handed the phone back to Dax, and finished her coffee and watched the light move down the field. Eli looked at her face and then at Dax's face, reading the situation with the accuracy of a child who had learned to read adults in the way that children learn to read weather, not from being told, but from paying attention. "Is it good news?" he said. "Yes," Ruth said. "Then why do you look like that?" Ruth looked at him. He was in his pajamas with wet grass between his toes and a serious expression, and he deserved a serious answer. "Because it's good news for us," she said. "And it should have been good news for other people too, and it wasn't. And that's worth sitting with for a minute, even when the news is good." Eli thought about this. "Because of what almost happened to us." "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "We can fix it for them too." "We can try," Ruth said. "That's already started." Eli looked at the pasture. He said, "I think Grandpa Earl would like that." Ruth looked at him. He was watching the light on the grass with the same open, uncomplicated expression that Earl had worn on this same ground on a summer morning 30 years ago, when something was simply and purely good. "Yes," Ruth said, "he would." 3 weeks later, in the third week of July, Franklin Pierce sent Ruth a letter on his firm's letterhead. It was 2 paragraphs long, precise, and without embellishment, which was the way Franklin communicated in writing. He saved his personality for phone calls. The first paragraph informed her that Harlan Land Holdings had, through their legal counsel, approached him with a settlement offer, full withdrawal of the foreclosure action, correction of the fraudulent payment record to reflect the actual payment history, and a financial settlement in the amount of $47,000, representing their acknowledgement of damages incurred by Ruth, including legal fees, lost productivity, and the damage to the equipment shed. The second paragraph informed her that Gerald Hogan had resigned from the bench, effective immediately, in lieu of facing a formal judicial conduct proceeding. The state attorney general had filed 5 counts of mortgage fraud against Harlan Land Holdings and 3 of its principal officers. A 6th count was anticipated once the Letcher County documentation was fully reviewed. Walter Briggs had retained separate counsel with Franklin's referral and was pursuing restoration of his property title. 2 other families in the county were in the early stages of the same process. Ruth read the letter twice at the kitchen table while Eli was eating breakfast. Then she set it face down beside her coffee cup. "Good news," Eli said, watching her. "Very good news. The farm kind. The farm kind." He went back to his cereal. He was not a boy who required extensive narration of events. He was content to wait until things were ready to be told. Ruth picked up the phone and called Franklin. He answered in the middle of the first ring, which meant he had been expecting her call. "Take the settlement," he said before she could speak. "I know," Ruth said. "Is it fair?" "It's not what a jury might award, but the money is real and immediate, and a jury is 2 years away and uncertain. The most important thing, the record correction is guaranteed in the settlement terms. The fraudulent default notation is removed from your mortgage record. The property title is cleared." He paused. "And the criminal case against the company and its officers proceeds regardless. The settlement doesn't touch that." "What about the others, Walter Briggs, the Letcher County families? Their situations are independent of yours legally, but your documentation was the fulcrum. Your case is what gave the AG's office the clean evidence they needed to move. Without your box, Earl's box, the fraud case against Harlan Land Holdings might have taken another 2 years to build." He paused. "Walter Briggs asked me to tell you something." "What?" He said, "Tell her the box did it. Tell her Earl did it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell him Earl would be glad to know it." She accepted the settlement that afternoon. Franklin filed the paperwork by 4 o'clock. By 5, the farm was legally, formally, finally, and completely hers. As it had always been, as it should have been, as it would remain. Ruth went to the east pasture by herself. She stood in the grass and looked at the ridge, which was very green in the July afternoon, and she did not cry because crying was not her character. But she stood in the place where she had stood with Earl on the best mornings, and she allowed herself the particular fullness of a thing completed. Earl had chosen this land. He had worked 30 years underground so they could own it above ground, and he had saved every piece of paper that had anything to do with it because he understood that paper was proof, and proof was protection. He had understood this without knowing why he would need it out of the same methodical instinct that had made him a careful man all his life. And because of that, because of 40 years of careful, the land was still hers, and the people who had tried to take it were facing federal charges. She looked at the ridge for a long time. Then she went back to the house and told Eli it was settled, and Eli said, "So we won." And she said, "We held what was ours," which was the more precise statement. And he thought about this and said, "That seemed right." Iron Covenant arrived 3 weeks after that on a Saturday morning in early August. Ruth had known they were coming. Dax had called the previous week to ask if the timing was acceptable. She had said yes, though she had not asked why or how many, partly because she had a sense of what it was, and partly because she did not want to know in advance. Knowing in advance would have required her to prepare emotionally, and she preferred to encounter things as they came. She was in the kitchen when she heard the engines. Eli was already on the porch. She went to the door. The convoy turned off the county road and came down the farm road in a procession she did not try to count immediately. She counted afterward from memory and came to 34. They came down the gravel in their customary formation, slower than they had that first night from the diner, and they filled the driveway and the pull-off beside the barn and the area along the fence with the ordered ease of people who had done this before. And then the engines cut off in sequence, and the quiet came in. They had brought things. This was what she had sensed. Trucks, 3 of them, pickup trucks, following the motorcycles down the farm road, were loaded with materials: lumber, sheet metal roofing, a generator, paint, the exterior kind, 2 5-gallon buckets of it, the same brown-gray that Earl had chosen for the outbuildings when he repainted them 8 years ago. A color she had never specified, but that was correct. Tools in organized cases: a chainsaw, a post-hole digger, a 2-man auger on a trailer behind the last truck. Dax walked toward the porch. He was not carrying anything yet, but he had the look of a man who was about to. "We heard the shed needs proper work," he said. "Not just the back wall, the whole thing." Ruth looked at the convoy, at the trucks, at the 33 people, men, and a few women. She now saw 3 women among them, all wearing the Iron Covenant vest, standing with the casual readiness of people who have arrived at a task. "You didn't have to do this," Ruth said. "We know," Dax said. The settlement covered what the law accounts for." He looked at her steadily. "We're not the law." Ruth looked at the shed. It was functional. It had been functional the whole time, even with the charred back wall, because she was not someone who allowed damage to make a building non-functional. But it needed work. Real work, the kind of work that required more than one person and more tools than she kept. And it had been on her mental list in the position reserved for things that needed to be done, and that she was working toward but had not yet reached. "There's also the north fence," Knox said. He was standing with 2 others near the truck with the post-hole digger. "We walked it while we were here. About 60 yards of the north stretch has posts that have been in the ground since the early 90s. Cedar posts, good wood, but they've had 30 years in Harlan County ground. Some of them will go in the next hard storm." Ruth had known about the north fence. It was also on the list in the same position. "The auger is for the new posts," Knox said. "We brought 24 cedar posts, 8 feet, treated for ground contact. That should handle the north run and the corner post on the east that's leaning." Ruth looked at Knox. He was perhaps 32, 33, with the capable hands of a man who had done real work for a long time, and the patience of someone who understood that work done well required attention and not just effort. He had spent 2.5 days at the end of July explaining the mechanics of a Harley-Davidson engine to her grandson, and had done it with the same thoroughness with which he was now describing a fence repair. "Eli's been asking about you," Ruth said. Knox smiled, a brief, genuine thing. "He's a good kid, asks real questions." "He does," Ruth said. Eli had emerged from behind her and was already walking toward the truck, looking at the equipment with the focused interest of a boy who has been given a new category of interesting things to pay attention to. Knox moved to join him, and the two of them fell into conversation at the tailgate of the truck, with the ease of people who had established in a previous encounter that they were worth talking to. Dax was watching this. "He'll remember this summer," he said. "I expect so," Ruth said. "It's been a summer worth remembering." She looked at the gathered people in her driveway and along her fence, and she thought about what it meant to have 34 people drive from wherever they had been to come to your property on a Saturday morning with lumber and paint and a post hole digger. She thought about what kind of debt produces that, and she arrived again at the same conclusion that it was not debt exactly, or not only debt. It was something older than debt. It was the particular form of obligation that comes when someone does the unreasonable right thing for you when they had every reason not to, and you spend the rest of your life looking for a way to answer it that is proportionate, and you never quite find one, and so you keep trying. She had opened a door in November, 14 years ago, and that door was still opening, still admitting things into the world. "Put everybody to work," she said to Dax. "Already planning to," he said. "And tell them there will be lunch at noon. I'll cook." Dax looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Ruth said. "I'm going to." She turned back toward the house. "I have a pot that holds 8 quarts, and I know how to use it." The day organized itself the way good work days organize, not with rigid scheduling, but with the organic efficiency of competent people who understand what they are doing and why. The shed crew, 7 strong, including Knox, stripped the damaged back wall and assessed the framing behind it, and found it sound except for 2 studs near the bottom that had taken smoke damage. They replaced the studs and began running new siding, the sound of nail guns and saws cutting clean through the morning air. The fence crew, 4 of them, plus the 2-man auger, moved methodically along the north stretch, pulling the leaning posts and setting the new ones. The auger chewing into the Kentucky ground in the particular way of mechanized tools applied to tasks that had previously required much more human effort. Dax worked. He had not assigned himself a supervisory position. He was on the shed crew running siding with a framing nailer, and he was good at it, efficient and precise. The movements of a man who had built things before and understood the satisfaction of a structure that comes together correctly. Otis and 2 others painted the east wall of the barn, which had been chalking for 2 seasons. Otis had asked Ruth what color, and she had shown him the chip she had saved from the last time Earl painted it, and he had matched it at the hardware store in Harlan that morning before they came out. Ruth cooked. She made the beef stew that had been Earl's standard request for every occasion requiring a large pot. Nothing complicated, brown beef and root vegetables and stock and time. The kind of thing that tastes of effort and care without the effort and care being individually identifiable in the flavor. She made 2 kinds of cornbread, one sweet and one not, because she had learned over 30 years of feeding people that the division between those who wanted sweet cornbread and those who considered it an affront ran deep and was not worth provoking a dispute over. When making both was not significantly more difficult, she made biscuits and set them out before the crew even came in. Eli helped. He was a competent kitchen assistant. Ruth had made sure of that over the years, because she considered cooking a basic survival skill and not a gendered one, and had made this clear to him early. And he moved between tasks with the focused efficiency of someone who has been given real responsibility and is taking it seriously. He stirred the stew. He watched the biscuits. He told Ruth while measuring cornmeal that Knox had said the auger could pull a fence post in about 30 seconds if the ground cooperated, which he found impressive, and Ruth did too, though she did not say so. At noon, the tools went down. 34 people plus Ruth and Eli sat on the porch and on the trucks and on lawn chairs that materialized from somewhere, and ate stew and cornbread and biscuits in the August heat. And the conversation that happens when people eat together happened not about the work or about what had brought them here, but the other things, the things that constitute a life around the edges of its central events. Ruth found herself in a conversation about the particular challenges of Eastern Kentucky timber management with a woman named Vanna, who had been with Iron Covenant 11 years and had grown up in Pike County herself. She found herself talking to Otis about the well pump, which Otis had a theory about based on a similar pump sound he had encountered on a property in Western Virginia, and which he offered to look at after lunch. She found herself for a few minutes simply sitting in the summer light with a bowl of her own stew on her own porch, on her own land, surrounded by the particular kind of noise that happens when people are comfortable enough to make noise. She thought this is what the land is for. Not just growing, not just holding, but receiving, being the place where people come. After lunch, the work continued. By 3 o'clock, the shed back wall was complete, the framing, solid new siding in place, and Knox had begun painting it the same gray-brown as the rest of the structure, freehand, without a guide, the brush moving with the ease of a man who had painted enough surfaces to have internalized the rhythm of it. By 4:30, the north fence was done, 24 new posts, the wire restretched, the corner posts plumbed and solid. Dax found Ruth standing at the north fence, looking at the new posts. "Good cedar," she said. "Earl always used cedar. Knox ordered it specifically," Dax said. He looked at the existing posts to match the dimension and the wood type. Ruth ran her hand along the new post nearest her. The wood was smooth from the mill pale tan, smelling of the particular sharp sweetness of fresh cedar. In 5 years, it would weather to gray and be indistinguishable from the old posts except by smell and the firmness of its set in the ground. "Tell me how Wade is doing," she said. "Not the version you've told me before. Tell me what he's actually like now." Dax leaned against the new fence post. He looked at the ridge. "He's quieter than he used to be. In a good way, not withdrawn, just settled. The horses did that. He says that animals require you to be present in a way that the road never did, because the road lets you be inside your own head, and horses won't allow it." A pause. "He's teaching his daughter to ride. She was afraid of them when she was small. She's not afraid now." "What's her name?" "Clara." Ruth looked at the ridge. A hawk was working the updraft above the tree line, circling in the wide, patient arcs of a bird that understands that persistence and not speed is what catches things. "Clara," she said. "That's a good name." He thought so. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to give him something from me. Not to send, I'll write it down, and you take it to him when you go to Colorado." "When I go," Dax said. "You'll go," Ruth said. "Eventually. I think you know that." He was quiet for a moment. The hawk above the ridge tilted and came around again, gaining altitude. "Maybe I will," he said. "Yes, I'll take it to him." "Good," Ruth said. "Come to the house before you leave today. I'll have it ready." She wrote it at the kitchen table on a piece of Earl's good stationery that she still had from the box Earl had bought 20 years ago for correspondence, the thick, cream-colored kind with a slight texture that Earl had liked because it felt like something worth keeping. She wrote 4 sentences. She wrote about the 4 days in November 14 years ago and what she had taken from them. Not the difficulty of it, but the clarity. She wrote that in 22 years of nursing, she had understood that being present with someone in a hard moment was the essential thing. Not what she said or did, but whether she was truly present. And that Wade had been the patient who showed her most clearly that she was capable of that presence, even when the circumstances were dangerous and the stakes were real. She wrote that she hoped Clara was not afraid of the horses anymore. She folded the paper and wrote his name on the outside and gave it to Dax when he came to the house at 5 o'clock to say goodbye. He read the name on the outside. He did not open it. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his vest with the same care with which a person places something irreplaceable. "You'll find the horses," Ruth said. He looked at her. "You think so?" "I do." She looked at him steadily. "You're not a man who settles. That means the work takes longer, but the horses are real when you find them." Dax was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The woman in Knoxville, my wife, her name is Shelby. She gardens. She has more patience than I do, which has never been hard to achieve. Ruth waited. I'm going to stop in Knoxville on the way back, he said. I don't know what that means yet, but I'm going to stop. Then stop, Ruth said. That's all stopping requires. He nodded once. Eli came in from the barn, where he had been with Knox until the last possible moment, his hands dirty and his face carrying the expression of a boy who has spent the day in the presence of interesting things and people and is not ready for it to be over. Are you leaving? He said to Dax. Yes, Dax said. Eli considered this. Then he stuck out his hand. Dax looked at the hand. He looked at the boy. Then he shook it, a real handshake, not the condescending version adults sometimes offer children, but the full version as between two people who have been through something together and are parting as equals. Knox said I could visit if we're ever in the same place, Eli said. Knox means what he says, Dax said. I know, Eli looked at him. Thank you for helping Ba. Dax looked at him for a moment. Your grandmother helped herself, he said. She had everything she needed. We just stood where she needed us to stand. Eli thought about this with the seriousness he brought to everything. That's still helping, he said. It is, Dax said. You're right. He went to the door. Then he stopped. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest beside the letter and took out something small. A patch, not a full vest patch, but a small embroidered medallion. Iron Covenant's cross and chains design, the kind that could be sewn or ironed onto a piece of clothing. He set it on the kitchen table. For Eli, he said, something to remember the summer by. Ruth looked at it. The cross and the chains, the same design as the tattoo on her wrist. She thought about what it would mean to Eli in 10 years and 20, this small piece of embroidered cloth that connected him to a summer he would spend the rest of his life understanding more fully. Thank you, she said. Dax nodded. Then he went out the door. The convoy left as it had arrived in procession, the engines building in sequence from the front of the line to the back. Ruth and Eli stood on the porch and watched. The last truck pulled out with the empty trailer behind it, and then the last motorcycle, Dax, in his customary position at the rear, and he did not look back. The sound of the engines moved down the farm road and turned onto the county road and faded east, and Harlan County settled back into its particular summer quiet, which was the sound of insects and birds, and the creak in the wind in the high timber, and nothing else. Ruth looked at the shed. New siding painted the color Earl had chosen. New posts along the north fence, the cedar pale against the summer grass. The east wall of the barn freshly painted, the chalking gone. The driveway cleaned of gravel that had been scattered into the grass. Things the work of a day had made right, that the work of a single person would have taken weeks. Eli leaned against her side. He was quiet for a minute, the way he was quiet when he was thinking something real. Bah, he said. When you helped that man in Pikeville, did you know it would turn into this? Ruth considered the question seriously because Eli's questions deserved serious consideration. No, she said. I didn't know anything beyond the next step. He needed help and I had the means to help. That was the whole of it at the time. But it kept going, Eli said. Things do, Ruth said. The good ones, especially. Eli looked at the ridge. The sky above the tree line was the deep blue of a summer evening, beginning to think about evening the light, angling long and gold across the pasture, the same light that fell on this land every August evening, and would fall on it after her and after Eli's children, if he had them, and after anyone alive in this county now. I want to be like you, Eli said. It was said without drama as a simple statement of intention. Ruth looked at him. He was 10 years old, standing barefoot on the porch in the summer light, his hands still dirty from the barn, the Iron Covenant medallion in his shirt pocket. She could not see all of what he would become from here, but some of what he would be had been shaped this summer by watching her stand on her own porch, with a federal order in a burned hand, by learning from Knox that real patience looks like attention, by eating stew with 34 people on a Saturday, and understanding that community is not always the one you are born into. Then open the door, Ruth said. When somebody knocks, open it. Eli looked at her. Even if you're scared, especially then, she said. He nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone committing something to memory. They stood on the porch until the light went off the pasture, and the ridge went dark, and the first stars came out. And then Ruth said, "Come help me with dinner." And Eli came in. In the weeks following, the county moved on, the way counties move slowly, in the incremental way of institutions that exist across time, rather than in moments. The Harlan County Courier ran a small article on the back page of the second section about the Attorney General's fraud investigation into Harlan Land Holdings, noting that the company had entered into a comprehensive settlement agreement covering 7 affected property owners. The article mentioned Gerald Hogan's resignation from the bench. It did not mention Ruth Carver by name. Ruth read the article at the kitchen table over her morning coffee, and then used it to line the bottom of the compost bucket, which was the appropriate fate for news that had already been lived. The settlement funds arrived in Franklin Pierce's trust account in the 3rd week of September. He called her to confirm receipt and to go through the disbursement. $47,000, the full amount agreed. Ruth listened to the figures and asked the questions she needed to ask, and thanked him for his work, which had been substantial, and which she did not take for granted. "What will you do with it?" Franklin asked, with the particular curiosity of a man who has spent years watching what people do with things they have fought for. Ruth thought about this. "The north timber lot needs thinning," she said. "I've been putting that off for 2 seasons, and I want to set aside something for Eli's college his parents are managing. But managing is different from comfortable, and Nora wouldn't take money directly, but a college account she couldn't argue with." A pause. "And I want to send something to Walter Briggs. Not money specifically. I'm thinking a load of cedar posts. He'll understand what I mean by it." Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, not polite. "Yes," he said. "He'll understand exactly what you mean." Ruth sent the cedar posts. She called the supplier in Harlan that Knox had used and ordered 2 dozen 8-foot treated cedar and had them delivered to the address Franklin gave her in Ohio. She did not include a note. The posts were the note. Walter Briggs called her on a Thursday evening in October, 6 weeks later. His voice was the voice of a man who had lived for 2 years with the particular weight of having lost something he should not have lost, and was now carrying the lighter thing of its return. He said, "The title came through." "Good," Ruth said. "I'm going back to Harlan County," he said, "in the spring. It's been in my family since 1931, 92 years. Does the house need work?" "Everything needs work. It's been empty 2 years." "Then you have a project," Ruth said. A pause. "Mrs. Carver, those posts. I understood what you meant. I want you to know I'll use every one of them." "I know you will," Ruth said. She did not tell him that the posts were also for her, that the act of sending them was as much for her own accounting as for his. That sometimes the most important thing you do for yourself is the thing you do for someone else. She did not say this because she did not need to say it. He already knew it. That was why he called. September turned to October, and October moved through the particular Kentucky beauty of it, the ridgeline going from green to red to gold. The mornings requiring a jacket now, the evenings coming earlier. Ruth put up the last of the garden, the usual accounting of what had done well and what had not, and what she would do differently next year. She cleaned the equipment shed thoroughly, the full top-to-bottom cleaning she did once a year in the fall, the annual assessment of what worked and what needed replacing, and what Earl had kept that she was keeping also, because some things you keep. She found at the back of the deepest shelf a pair of work gloves she had not seen in 3 years. Earl's gloves in the particular deterioration of gloves that have been used for real work for a long time. She stood with them in her hands for a moment, the shed light on the smell of fall and machinery around her, and she felt the weight of their emptiness. She put them back on the shelf, not because she could not deal with the feelings she could. She had had 3 years of practice dealing with exactly this feeling in exactly this way, the small ambushes of the everyday, the things that have no warning, but because the shelf was where they lived, and they would stay there, And that was right. Earl had worked in the ground for 30 years and had bought this land and had kept every receipt and had chosen this shed and this shelf and this farm, and she would keep his gloves on the shelf for as long as she used the shed and beyond, because the things that persist are the things that are worth persisting. And his careful hands had worked this land as fully as her careful hands had, and the shelf remembered them. She closed the shed, locked it, and went back to the house. Nora called that evening, which she did on most Tuesday evenings, and they talked about Eli's school year, and about Nora's work, and about the farm, and about the coming winter and its preparations. Toward the end of the call, Nora said, "I've been thinking about what you told me, about the door." "Which part?" "The part where you said you didn't think of it as a choice. When you opened the door in Pikeville." A pause. "I think about that sometimes when I'm in the middle of a shift, and I'm tired, and I just want to go home, and a patient needs something. I try to do what you did, not to decide, just to do the next thing." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Does it work?" "Mostly," Nora said. "Not always. I'm not you." "I'm not always me either," Ruth said. "I just try to be most of the time." Nora laughed. It was Earl's laugh, the shape of it, the timing. Ruth closed her eyes for a second when she heard it. "Good night, Mom," Nora said. "Good night," Ruth said. She put the phone down and stood in the kitchen and listened to the October farm, quieter than August, the insects gone, the nights colder and longer, the year beginning its retreat into the next year. She thought about the coming winter and its particular pleasures. The light through the east window on short afternoons, the sound of the wood stove, the quality of silence that snow produces when it comes, the way the farm simplified itself in the cold to its essential bones, and the essential work of keeping things alive. She thought about Dax in Knoxville, stopped at his door, and wondered whether he had knocked, and whether Shelby had opened it, and what had come after. She did not know, and might not know for some time, and that was all right. Some stories you learn the middle of later, when enough of them has become the past that it can be told. She thought about Eli at his school in Lexington, with the Iron Covenant medallion on the shirt he wore on days that mattered to him, and the way he had decided something in the settled part of himself, and the way she believed him. She looked at her wrist. The tattoo faded and familiar, the cross and the chains, and the cracked bar small against the skin of a 68-year-old woman's forearm. It had started as a thank you from a man with no other language for what he felt. It had become a kind of promise, the complex living kind that gets kept across years and across miles, and through the particular mechanics of coincidence and consequence and a child's innocent observation in a roadside diner. She had spent 14 years wearing it without thinking about it much. She would spend whatever remained of her years wearing it the same way without thinking about it much, doing the next thing, opening the door when someone knocked. That was the whole of it. That was all it had ever been. The last evening of August, Nora had come to take Eli home. She had driven up on a Sunday evening, and Ruth had watched from the porch as the car came down the farm road with the headlights on the sky, behind the ridge still faintly lit with the last of the summer dusk. Nora had gotten out and hugged Ruth for longer than she usually did, and Nora had looked at the shed and the fence and the painted barn wall and asked to hear all of it. Ruth had told her all of it. Nora had listened, and when Ruth was done, Nora had said, "You saved a man's life. And 14 years later, 34 people came and fixed your shed." And Ruth had said that was not quite how she would describe the sequence. And Nora had said, that was the sequence. And Ruth had thought about it and decided Nora was probably right. Before Eli left, he had hugged her on the porch, his thin arms around her waist, his face against her flannel shirt, and she had held him and felt his warm weight and everything that came with it, the summers ahead and the summers already past, and the particular irreplaceable quality of this child who had said an innocent thing in a diner and opened a door she had not known needed opening. "I'll be back next summer," he had said. "I know," she had said. "I'm going to look up how quarter horses work before I come back, So I know things when Knox talks about them. Knox will appreciate that. He had pulled back and looked at her and said the things she had not expected, the simple statement of intention she would carry forward into the winter and beyond. When I'm old enough, I'm going to open the door. And she had looked at him, 10 years old, barefoot on the porch in the summer light, the Iron Covenant medallion on his shirt, and she had said, I know you will. The kettle was on. It was always on in the evenings of her life on this farm. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the October dark at the shed, with its new siding, the fence, with its new cedar posts, the barn freshly painted, the 40 acres still and settled under the autumn sky. She looked at the tattoo on her wrist, the cross in the chains, the cracked bar where a needle had slipped 14 years ago when a man was learning to be grateful and did not have enough words for it. It had words now. It had 34 motorcycles on a Saturday morning, and a boy who wanted to be like her, and a letter traveling toward Colorado, and a woman in Knoxville who gardened and had patience, and a man standing at a door deciding whether to knock. It had 40 acres still. It had always had 40 acres. The kettle whistled. Ruth turned from the window and went to it. Outside the farm settled into the Kentucky dark, the way it settled every night, patient specific, rooted in exactly this ground. The creek ran, the timber held the ridge. The stars came out one by one above the east pasture, and the night came on, and the land was still there as it had always been, as it would remain. Some things are simple. Some things are only simple. Ruth made tea, and inside the house was warm and lit, and the door was closed but not locked because it had never needed to be. The month at settlements move with a particular quality of time after a long effort has been resolved, not empty but spacious, in a way that recovering time always is. Ruth found herself doing things she had been putting aside for months, not because she had lacked time, but because the weight of the unresolved legal question had been sitting at the back of every day like a stone in a shoe. And now that it was gone, she could move in the way she wanted to move. She thinned the North Timber lot in the second week of August, hiring Floyd Weaver's nephew for 2 days to help with the chainsaw work. The lot had been crowded for 3 seasons, the young trees competing for light and root space, and the thinning opened the canopy and let the afternoon light reach the forest floor in the way it had when she and Earl had first walked those acres. She dragged the cut wood to the south edge of the lot and split what was worth splitting for winter fuel, and left the rest to decay in the slow, useful way that fallen wood decays in a forest. She got the well pump sorted following the method Otis had suggested over lunch, a sequence of adjustments to the pressure tank that she had not tried because it was not in the manufacturer's documentation, and she had been operating from the documentation and not from accumulated practical knowledge. The grinding noise stopped on the 3rd day after the adjustment. She called Otis to tell him, and he said he was glad, and they talked for 20 minutes about other things before she remembered to end the call. She started the college account for Eli. It required more paperwork than she expected, and 2 trips to the bank in Harlan, and a call to Nora to sort out the beneficiary documentation. And she did all of it without telling Eli, because the account was not a gift that needed announcing. It was a fact that would simply be there when the time came, the way Earl's careful records had simply been there when the time came, the way certain kinds of love make themselves known, not in gesture, but in preparation. Franklin called in mid-September to tell her that the state AG had finalized charges against 3 officers of Harlan Land Holdings. The company itself had entered a plea arrangement. He also said that the county recorder, who had processed the fraudulent mortgage documents without flagging the irregularities, had been removed from his position pending an investigation into his conduct across 4 years of filings. Ruth received this information over her morning coffee and said, "Good," and meant it. She thought about the recorder, the man who had processed the document, and looked the other way. She did not know him personally. She knew his type, not a bad man, probably not someone who had set out to hurt anyone, just someone who had been offered a small convenience in exchange for a small compromise, and had not looked far enough past the convenience to see the cost. She had seen that type her whole career in nursing. Administrators who approved the faster, cheaper course of action without fully accounting for the patient at the end of the chain. It was not the same thing as cruelty. It was the failure of imagination that allows small corruptions to persist because no one has connected the decision to the person it falls on. She was not forgiving about it. She was clear-eyed about it, which is different. Clear-eyed means you see the thing accurately without the distortion of either rage or excuse. She had spent 68 years developing that particular clarity, and she was not going to misuse it now. The Letcher County case resolved in October. Two families, both elderly, both recently widowed, both holding land that sat above the same shale formation as Ruth property, had their fraudulent foreclosure judgments vacated. Their situations had been documented through the same mortgage alteration method used on Ruth's property. And once the AG had the full forensic comparison from Ruth's case, the Letcher County analysis had taken a fraction of the time. Franklin called to tell her, and Ruth sat at the kitchen table and thought about those two families, whose names she did not know, who had spent months or years believing they had lost things that were theirs, and were now being told they had not lost them after all. The relief of that must be large, she thought. The disorientation of it must be large too. Getting back a thing you had accepted as lost required a readjustment of the understanding you had built in the interval of losing it, and that readjustment was its own kind of work. She hoped they had people to help them with it. She hoped they had neighbors who brought food when things were hard, and attorneys who answered the phone when they called, and children or grandchildren who put their arms around them and asked if they were okay with the directness that young people have before they learn to be careful about the question. She thought about writing to them. She did not know their names or their addresses, but Franklin would. And Franklin was not the kind of attorney who would be surprised if a client asked for a courtesy referral. She thought about what she would say, that she had been where they were and understood some of it, and that the land was worth what it had cost, and that the spring would come, and the first thing to do was plant something. She wrote the letters in October, and Franklin forwarded them. She received 3 weeks later a card from one of the families, a man in his 70s named Holden, from a settlement east of Whitesburg, whose wife had died the previous year, and whose family had farmed the same ridge for 4 generations. He had written in the large, slightly unsteady hand of someone who did not write many letters. "Thank you for what you did. Without your box, we would still be in Ohio. My granddaughter planted daffodil bulbs this week along the south fence. It feels right." Ruth put the card on the refrigerator under a magnet Earl had brought back from a trip to the Great Smoky Mountains in 1994. It stayed there through the winter. Dax called in November, 3 months after the August day at the farm. He was calling from Knoxville. He did not say anything about Shelby directly, but the quality of his voice was different from the quality it had carried on the road, less coiled, less contained, with a looseness in it that was not carelessness, but rest. Ruth asked how the road had treated him, and he said he had not been on it much lately, and she said that sounded about right, and he agreed that it did. He had spoken to Wade, he said. He had driven to Colorado in October and spent 5 days at the ranch in the San Luis Valley, and he described it the way people describe places that exceed expectation, with a slight wonder that they could not fully account for, a quality of surprised recognition, as if the place confirmed something they had hoped was true about the world. The valley was flat and wide, and the mountains on the eastern edge were enormous in the clear October air, and Wade had met him at the gate on horseback, which Dax had not expected, and which had struck him as exactly the kind of person Wade had become. He had given Wade the letter. Wade had read it at the kitchen table while Dax sat across from him, and when he was done, he had folded it very carefully and put it in the front pocket of his shirt directly over his chest, and he had not said anything for a long moment. Then he had said, "She wrote that she hoped Clara was not afraid of the horses anymore." And Dax had said, "Is she?" And Wade had looked out the window at the pasture where Clara was riding a gray quarter horse in the cold October morning, her breath visible in the air, the horse moving at a slow canter. And Wade had said, Not for a long time now. Ruth held the phone and listened to Dax tell her this, and she stood in her October kitchen and looked at the ridge and felt something settle in her that had not entirely settled until this moment, the full completion of the thing that had begun on a November night in Pikeville 14 years ago, when she had opened a door and found a man who needed what she had to give, and had given it, and had not thought about it again for a long time, and was now standing in the middle of all of it, coming back. "Thank you for going," she said. "It was worth going," Dax said. She said, "Tell me about the horses when you see him again." "I will," he said. After the call, Ruth went to the east pasture. It was October now, and the grass was brown, and the trees along the fence line had turned, and some had already dropped their leaves, and the ridge above was the particular bare-limbed dark of a Kentucky hardwood forest in fall. She stood in the place where she had stood with Earl on the good mornings, and with Dax on the June morning after Keller left, and she looked at the ridge and the sky above it, and the particular quality of October light, which is the most honest of all the season's lights. Not dramatic, not golden, just clear and equal, and unwilling to flatter anything it falls on. The land was hers. It had always been hers. It would remain hers, and then it would be someone else's, as it had been someone else's before Earl bought it. And the land would outlast all of them, in the way that land outlasts the people who believe they own it, by revealing over enough time that ownership and belonging are not the same thing. You could own land and not belong to it. You could belong to land without owning it. Ruth and Earl had been lucky enough to do both, to have both the legal fact and the genuine belonging, the paper and the 30 years of working it, the receipts and the knowledge. She looked at the wrist. The tattoo faded now to a soft gray blue, the cross and the chains barely distinguishable in the October light from the creases of age in the skin around it. Still there, still the same crack at the upper right, still the marker left by a man who had no other language for what he felt, and had used the only language he had, and had placed it exactly where it needed to be placed, and had trusted that it would do what he intended it to do. It had done what he intended. It had taken 14 years in a 10-year-old boy's innocent observation in a diner, but it had done exactly what he intended. Ruth turned her wrist over and looked at the tattoo for a long moment in the October light. Then she went back to the house. There was dinner to make and wood to stack, and the wood stove to check, and an invoice to review, and a letter to write to Eli about the quarter horse information she had found for him, because she had looked it up after their last call and had more to say on the subject than she had expected. Because when you start looking at a thing carefully, you find it is larger and more interesting than the outside of it suggests. This was true of horses. It was true of most things. She went inside and turned on the kitchen light, and the warm yellow of it covered everything. And she stood in the kitchen that smelled of the day's work and the coming evening, and she thought about all of it, the 40 years on this land, and the 3 years without Earl, and the summer that had nearly taken the land, and the people who had stood between her and the taking. And she received it in the way that she received most things, not with ceremony, not with drama, but with the plain acknowledgement that this was her life, and it had been, in the particular accounting she applied to it, a good one. She put the kettle on. She made the tea. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the letter she was writing to Eli, and picked up the pen and continued from where she had left off. And the October night moved around the farm in the dark, and the farm held its ground, and the creek ran, and somewhere east of the ridge the stars were out above the San Luis Valley, and a woman named Clara was not afraid of horses anymore. Ruth wrote her letter, and the night went on. There were mornings that winter when Ruth stood at the kitchen window before sunrise with her first coffee and watched the dark above the ridge and thought about the shape of the year she had come through. Not obsessively, she was not a person given to obsession or to extended retrospection as a general practice. But in the particular quiet of a winter farm before the light came, with the wood stove putting out its steady warmth, and the animals settled in the barn, and the creek frozen at its edges, though still running in the middle, She allowed herself the kind of deliberate reflection that the busy months had not made room for. She thought about Eli in the diner, his uncomplicated, unafraid attention, the way he had looked at the tattoo and simply said what he saw. Children under 10 are the most honest observers in any room because they have not yet learned the social cost of honesty and the social value of tact. By the time they have learned both, the pure observation has been somewhat diluted, and they notice things but edit before they speak, and the unedited version never arrives. Eli had not yet made that trade. He had looked at Dax Steele's arm and looked at Ruth's wrist and said what was obvious to him, and that plainness had set everything else in motion. She thought about what it meant that a 10-year-old's innocent observation could undo 6 months of careful fraud. The fraud had been built on the assumption that Ruth was alone in the county, alone in her knowledge, alone in her capacity to resist. The people who built it had not accounted for the possibility that a chance connection made in a diner would bring 34 people and a Lexington attorney and a federal judge into the picture within 12 hours. They had not accounted for it because it was not a reasonable thing to account for. It was improbable. It was the kind of thing that people say would not happen in real life. But real life produces these improbabilities constantly, Ruth thought, not rarely, but with a regularity that suggests improbability is not as uncommon as it appears. Only as uncommon as the attention we pay to it. Most improbabilities happen and pass without being noticed, folding back into the ordinary current of events. The ones that get noticed are the ones with stakes high enough that people have reason to follow the thread backward to its origin. Follow it back far enough, and you always arrived at some small, improbable, completely ordinary moment. A boy with a notebook in a diner looking at a man's arm. She thought about Wade Briggs in Colorado teaching his daughter to ride in the cold October mornings. She thought about Dax in Knoxville, with whatever was being rebuilt there, the specific patient work of two people deciding what they still were to each other. She thought about Franklin Pierce, who had filed a restraining order between midnight and 7 in the morning because he was fast and did not panic, and had a deep personal antipathy toward Harlan Land Holdings. She thought about Otis, who had walked her north fence line with the thorough attention of a man who understood fences, and Knox, who had asked the right questions about wood type and post dimension, and the woman named Vanna, who had grown up in Pike County and understood eastern Kentucky timber in the way that people understand the land they came from. She thought about Walter Briggs in Ohio waiting for his title to be restored, planning his return to Harlan County in the spring. She thought about the Holden family east of Whitesburg planting daffodil bulbs along the south fence because it felt right. She thought about the two families whose names she still did not know, who had been restored to land they had believed lost, and were now facing the particular task of returning to a place that had continued without them. She thought about Earl's gloves on the shelf in the equipment shed. She thought about Earl's handwriting in the labeled envelopes. She thought about the morning he had shown her the east pasture for the first time, the light on the ridge, his face open and uncomplicated. She thought about what he would have said about all of it, the fraud, the bikers, the federal order, Eli, and the diner. And she thought he would have said exactly what Nora had said. You saved a man's life. And 14 years later, 34 people came and fixed your shed. He would have said it simply, without embellishment, and he would have been right. And she would have told him he was oversimplifying. And he would have said, that was how you knew a thing was true. She stood at the window and watched the dark above the ridge give way to the particular deep blue that comes before dawn, the color that means the light is on its way but has not arrived. And she thought, the land is still here. The creek is still running. The shed is repaired and the fence is new, and the barn is painted, and the 40 acres are mine. And somewhere outside this kitchen window, in the cold of a Kentucky winter morning, whatever Earl left in the ground and in the air of this place is still here too. The way the presence of a person who has worked a piece of land long enough becomes part of it, becomes something you can feel in the particular quality of the quiet. She drank her coffee. The dark above the ridge went from blue to gray. The gray began to lighten at the eastern edge. The creek continued. When the first real light came over the ridge and into the kitchen window, the January light, thin and clear and without warmth, but honest Ruth set down her cup and went to get dressed and start the day. There was wood to bring in, and animals to feed, and a letter to Eli about quarter horses still sitting on the table waiting to be finished. There was the wood stove to tend and the morning chores, and after that probably a call from Nora, and after that, whatever the day brought. The farm was full of what needed doing, which was the right way for a farm to be. She buttoned her coat and went out into the January morning, and the cold came in sharp and particular and fully itself, and the farm was there around her exactly as it was, exactly as it had been. And she went to do the work that needed doing. That was all. That had always been enough.